Thank you very much. I hope you can see me over the lectern. It's a little bit low going on here. Thank you to Kenny for inviting me, and thank you all for you coming along tonight. I thought I'd begin by telling you a little bit about me, so you know who I am. I began my career in studying psychology at University College London quite a few years ago now, unfortunately. And after I graduated, I began working as a military scientist at the Defence Evaluation and Research Agency in Farnborough. And when I was there, I studied a neuroscience master's part-time. I had a great time working at Farnborough, and this was because my interest in neuroscience began there, and it wasn't just because I got to see soldiers running around on Salisbury Plain. Anybody who says that is a liar. When I was working there, I had the opportunity to actually do a PhD part-time. But when I looked into the realities of this and asked my bank manager if I could actually get a mortgage on my salary, I took his laughter to mean no. So I decided it wouldn't be such a bad thing to go back into education full-time. And then I moved up to Warwick University to do my PhD. I completed that a couple of years ago. And then after a few years as just being a kind of jobbing scientist over here at Aston University, I began my first postdoc position about a year and a half ago now. And I'm also employed as a sessional lecturer in the psychology department. Now, what I'm going to talk to you about today is my growing interest in the perception of beauty. And this is whether it's a beautiful face or a beautiful body. As well as looking at the differences in what we know about the way people perceive beauty, the most exciting part of the work that I'm doing is trying to understand what happens in the individual's brain when they're actually appraising beauty in somebody. And I'm hoping that eventually this will help us understand how people who have been diagnosed with an eating disorder, such as anorexia nervosa, actually misperceive beauty in others. Academia can be quite a solitary environment to work in. Everybody is judged by the work that they produce, so people can get a little bit obsessive about it and very secretive about what they're doing. But over in Aston, we very much have a team spirit going on. And the fact that we actually have a lucky table in our local pub tells you where we get most of our ideas from, so it's a great environment to work in. But the second reason is because of the equipment that we have available to us. For years now, Aston has been at the forefront of neuroimaging techniques, whether it's in how you actually record brain activity or how you analyze that data to make sense of the information that we're recording. Now, one of the studies that I'm going to be talking to you about today is recorded using a MEG system, which is magnetoencephalography. Now, regardless of whether we're awake or sleeping, the cells in our brain are in constant communication with one another. And every time a piece of information is passed from one neuron to another, there's an electrical potential created. And surrounding this potential automatically is a magnetic field. Now, as these magnetic fields travel directly out of the brain, we can then record the distribution of these fields on the scalp and try and make sense about what activity is happening in the brain. Now, to make these recordings, you sit in this surprisingly comfortable chair, so much so I tend to fall asleep every time I take part in an experiment. And you're raised up within the system until your head sits really neatly inside the helmet of the scanner. If we could then take a look inside the scanner, we'd see that on the inside of the helmet, there's a number of sensors. To be precise, is 276. And these are specially designed to pick up the extremely small magnetic fields that are produced in the brain. Now, these sensors are superconducting, so they have to sit in a vat of liquid helium at about a temperature of minus 270 degrees. And once the magnetic fields have been detected, they're converted into a digital format and stored on the computer within the lab. Now, what's so good about this technique is that these magnetic fields that are reflecting the brain activity are recorded in real time. So we have millisecond precision in our recordings. Then we can look at the data and use computer programs to work out where in the brain the changes have happened. and more importantly, exactly when those changes happened. Now, in terms of what it feels like to actually be in one of these scanners, it's pretty much like sitting in a very large old-fashioned hairdryer, but without the noise. There's absolutely no noise associated with it. And like I say, I do tend to fall asleep, so you're completely comfortable. Now, the only way you tend to know that the recording is actually being done is because the experimenter has told you to actually do something, and you have to sit still. So it's quite a passive procedure. The other technique that I use is MRI scanning, and that's magnetic resonance imaging. Now, basically, the MRI scanner is a massive magnet. Therefore, whereas in MEG we're recording magnetic fields, during an MRI scan, we actually produce a magnetic field. Now, the reason we do this is that we know that the hydrogen atoms, which are plentiful in the brain, behave differently when they're in a magnetic field. Furthermore, this odd behavior that they display is slightly different depending on the strength of the field that they're in. So during a basic anatomical MRI scan, we can apply a magnetic field of a different strength across the head and then reproduce the position of the hydrogen atoms present within the neurons of the brain. And this allows us to create a highly detailed picture of the structure of the brain. We can then perform another type of scan, which is called a functional or fMRI scan, which this time focuses on the hydrogen atoms that are present in glucose. Whenever any part of the brain is busy, it needs glucose to feed the energy that's going on. Now, we can identify the areas of the brain that have just used up a lot of glucose, and therefore infer that they've just recently been used in a task. We can then combine the information that's present with the anatomical data we have, so we can see then the blobs coloured blobs you can see there are the functional information, which is overlaid on to the anatomical scan. Please do come in, don't worry. Now, going into an MRI scanner is quite different from going into the MEG scanner. Now, because it's such a powerful magnet, no metal at all can enter into the scan room. So therefore, we have to work to a very strict safety procedure at all times. There was one day I was standing next to the scanner, busily sorting out somebody going in, and I began to think, well, what's that rubbing against my chin? And my necklace, I didn't realise that it was the metal in the chain was ferrous, and it was just hovering in the air. So you have to be really, really careful at all times that no metal will go into the room. Now, during the scan, you actually lie down on the bed and you're moved into the centre of the magnet. So if you are a little bit claustrophobic, it's not the most ideal environment to go into. And also the scan is very noisy. It's quite a shock when it starts, but amazingly you get used to it very, very quickly. And yet again, I do fall asleep during these scans, so I'm not the world's best participant for these experiments, but I still do them. Now, these are the techniques that I'll be using and talking about today. But before I tell you a bit about the experiments that I've performed, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we know about the perception of beauty already. Now, beauty is seen as a sign to the rest of the world that the individual is fit and healthy. In the race for survival, if you're beautiful, then you're a good bet. Faces like these send out to others signals that you're not only fit, but you're fit for use as well. Therefore, you're telling people that you have good genes and that you'd make a good mate because your offspring would also have good genes. So being beautiful is really like having the results of a medical on display all of the time. But how can being beautiful reflect that we have a good genetic makeup? Well, it's all down to our sex hormones. Estrogen for women, testosterone for men. The facial characteristics of these two individuals that make them attractive are caused by the presence of sex hormones. And it's the frivolous use of them as beauty markers that gives a direct indication of exactly how good a specimen that individual is. Under normal circumstances, estrogen and testosterone are essential components of our immune system. They ensure that the immune system is ready to fight any incoming antigens into our body and then allow us to repair any cells that may have been damaged. Beauties is the body's way of boasting that it's in such good working order that it can be wasted on using these beauty markers. So my immune system is working so well that I can waste my hormones on looking pretty. So, for example, in women, estrogen results in fat deposits in the upper cheek and the lip area, which are features considered to be highly attractive by men. As we become older, though, the balance between estrogen and testosterone within our body shifts, and our faces slightly become more masculine. Now, these are subtle changes. I don't want to depress all the women in the audience and scare all the men in the audience. You don't suddenly look like a man overnight. But there's really subtle changes that go on. One of the main ones being a thinning of the lips. And it explains why there is this now craze for collagen implants to try and create the youthful beauty markers in a female face. Now, for men, the body's flippant use of testosterone results in features such as a larger brow, and this creates the top half of the face being broader than the bottom, and also a more prominent jawline. Now, just to disappoint you, these two beautiful individuals up here aren't actually real. They're produced by a laboratory in the University of Regensburg in Germany, and they were made by morphing together 4 faces that were previously rated as attractive. And then when these morphed faces were compared to real individuals, unfortunately, these guys were the ones that were rated more attractive. Now, another indicator of genetic health and therefore beauty is facial symmetry. The extent to which the left and right sides of our face are similar is determined when we're in the womb. The more environmental stressors that we encounter during our development, so for example, pollution in the air or a poor diet, the less symmetrical we end up when we're born. Now, studies have shown that people with symmetrical faces are rated as more attractive. The theory being that they're a sign of a strong genetic makeup as the individual has come under less stress while they were in the womb. Now, the Regensburg lab has come up with a really clever way of testing this hypothesis. Now, I'm sure you're not going to be surprised that you can't physically make somebody more symmetrical. So the obvious way to do this would be to take their picture, copy one half of their face, create a mirror image, and put them together to form a new face. Well, the results are, bless, a little bit disconcerting there. It gives the face a slightly funny pointed look, and I hope you can see there. You can also see the line down the centre of the face that's been used to create the mirror image, and this is very obvious in the hairline. So what this lab has done is create a piece of software that actually keeps the shape of the face, but all the features are made symmetrical, and also the skin tone and skin features are balanced across the face as they were originally, and the hairline is maintained. Now, when these images are rated by people, the symmetrical version is again considered to be more attractive than the original face. Now, another experiment performed by this German laboratory provides support for one of the main theories of attraction, and that is that average is best. Here we have Miss Germany 2002, although not photographed in the most attractive of situations. Hair scraped back, no makeup, and very close-up features. But this is the kind of photo that has to be used in a scientific experiment. And what we have next to her is the virtual Miss Germany. Now, this was produced by taking photos of all 7 finalists of the competition in this year, morphing them together to produce this virtual person. When people were asked to rate all 8 photos, the Miss Virtual Germany was found to be the most attractive, receiving an average rating of 6.2 on a scale of 0 to 7. The actual Miss Germany only had a rating of 2.8 under these circumstances. But luckily, she's not going to bump into this girl, so there shouldn't be a cat fight anywhere. Now, the reason that average is thought to be more beautiful is again linked to our genes. The process of natural selection does automatically favour the mean. Any big changes to our genes only work if it means that we're going to be more likely to survive as a species. So therefore, the average is associated with a good, solid genetic makeup. Now, I'm going to use these next examples to explain another couple of theories, but I want you to do a little bit of deciding first. Take a look at these four men and decide which you think is the most attractive. Now, if you think that gentleman B is more attractive, then your results then are supporting the average is best hypothesis. This face is a composite face made up from 117 randomly selected men. And this average together produces what is seen to be an attractive face. And it's in line with most of the British studies that are performed looking at attractiveness. Face D, on the other hand, is this average face which is warped 50% towards an extremely masculine face. Now, if you found this face more attractive, then you're in line with the American studies that have been performed. And it's thought to be that there's a number of cultural reasons why this is so. But also, if we look at face A, we could have a very different explanation for this. Face A is that average face in B, but warped 20% towards the female average face. And there are certain times in a woman's menstrual cycle that she will find this kind of face more attractive. Now, hormones don't just influence the way that we look, they also influence how women find men attractive. During ovulation, when women are most fertile, they tend to rate the very masculine face that we see in D as being the most attractive. And then at other times in the cycle, it's face A that's seen to be more attractive. And this is thought to reflect the downside of the presence of testosterone in the male body. Even though these masculine features are seen as being very attractive and are rated as attractive by women, women also attribute very negative personality characteristics to these features. So they don't actually consider men like this to be a good choice as a life partner. However, men who have the more feminized features are thought to be less attractive, but women attribute good characteristics to them, and so they're seen as a good life partner choice. So evidently, ladies, we're all very calculating creatures who will go out and have a one-night stand with a gym instructor in order to get the good genes, and then we go home to the accountant in order to have a safe, secure place for the babies to be brought up. I'm hoping that's not the case. Now, although these theories do make evolutionary sense, they do leave us a little bit cold, as we see with that example. What about beauty for beauty's sake? Do we really only look at people and rate their attractiveness in terms of their functionality? You've got good genes, I reckon you must be pretty good looking then. It's not a very nice way to think about things. Well, there are a lot of researchers, myself included, who think that this can't be the full story. Yes, these evolutionary factors will be subtly influencing the choices that we make. But there will be times that we see beauty in someone and simply want to look at them just because they're beautiful. Just in the same way that we can look at beautiful pictures and beautiful buildings. Beauty can be appreciated on an aesthetic level as well as a functional level. And it's been known since ancient Egypt that objects that are proportioned according to the golden ratio are considered to be aesthetically pleasing. Now let's start with a simple object, a line. If we segment that line here, we create a line that has a short section and a long section. Now this seems pretty simple enough, but the position that that section occurs gives the line an unusual property. the ratio between the short section and the long section is 1 to 1.618. Furthermore, if we looked at the ratio between the long section and the length of the line of the whole line, that too would be 1 to 1.618. If we then duplicate the line and produce a new line where the long section is now the short section of this longer line, the ratio between the two sections is again still 1 to 1.618. Now this special property means that the section is called the golden section and the ratio is the golden ratio. And because this number is so important, 1.618 is called phi. So let's go back to our original line. This golden section line can also duplicate along itself along two dimensions to produce various golden shapes. We have the golden triangle, golden pentagon, and the golden decagon. Now the relationship that we see here applies to more complex shapes too. Combinations of these golden elements can be used to describe the proportion of the majority of aesthetically pleasing objects, even faces. The proportions of a beautiful face can be described by the golden ratio. The width of the mouth to the width of the cheeks is a golden line. The nose is a golden triangle, and the tip of the nose is a golden pentagon. If we take a look at Elizabeth Hurley's face, we can see that the golden mask fits her perfectly. Her proportions within her face all fit that golden ratio. So do we know if these functional and aesthetic appraisals of faces can be separated? Well, we thought the best way to find out would be to see if there's any difference in the brain activity when straight men and women rated male and female faces. You'd expect that a functional appraisal would occur when rating the opposite sex. However, because the appraisal of the same sex has no evolutionary benefit, we'd hope to see that the brain activity there would reflect this aesthetic appraisal only. Now, the first thing we had to do was to create a collection of pictures to use in our experiment of both men and women who were attractive and unattractive, and then run a study to ensure that the categories that we felt they fell into, everybody else felt they fell into as well. So we asked 25 men and 25 women to rate the photos on a scale of where 0 was very unattractive and 7 was very attractive. Now we can see from the results here that the average ratings given to the photos corresponded to the categories that we placed them in, so we were happy. We had good stimulus. Now the pink bars represent the ratings given by women, and blue bars represent the ratings given by men. You can see what I've done there, hopefully. And straight away, we can see something really interesting going on. Men and women give the same ratings for all of the categories, except when they were judging attractive men. Men were able to differentiate between unattractive and attractive men. We can see that there is a difference there. But the ratings that they gave to attractive men were significantly lower than the ratings that women gave the same attractive men. Now, initially, we thought that this meant that the men weren't really looking at the photos of attractive men, like, oh, I don't really need to look at that. So we produced a graph showing the time that people looked at these pictures for and how long it took them to make their appraisal. And we can see that everybody took about the same length of time to make their decisions. So does this mean that men can only perform functional appraisals of beauty? Are they unable to see aesthetic beauty in other men? Or do they stop themselves from seeing aesthetic beauty in men? So typically, before we've begun to answer our main research question, we've already created another one, which is basically how science works. And this is one of the things that we do. We start to answer one and then find out we've got another 5 questions that need to be answered. So this is very much still a work in progress. So back to the original study that we wanted to do then, we took a group of people, placed them in the MEG scanner, and got them to do the same study, using different people, obviously, but rating these faces to see whether they thought they were attractive or unattractive. Now, again, this is where you get a glimpse of realism in science. Unfortunately, this turned out to only be a pilot study rather than a full study, because our scanner got upgraded halfway through us running it, and we couldn't compare the data sets anymore. So at the moment, we only have the data for the men rating the pictures. Now, because our brains are continually active, in any neuroimaging experiment that we perform, you have to have a control condition that activates, hopefully, everything but the type of task that you're interested in. So in this case, we got the participants to look at a cross in the center of the screen in order to just engage their attention and their visual system. We then showed them a face to judge, and this enabled us to look at a period of time around their rating and the period of time before they made their rating in order to compare the brain activation. So what did we see happening in the brain? Well, the first thing we looked at was simply the activation associated with looking at faces. We know from fMRI studies that there's an area of the brain that's specialized for face perception, but people felt that this activation was too deep within the brain to actually be seen with an MEG experiment. But as we've done so in previous occasions in our lab, we were able to see activation of this area, and this is called the lateral fusiform gyrus. But what was really interesting about this activation was when the men were looking at an attractive female, the activation in this fusiform gyrus decreased. We then found that there was an increase in activity in the frontal area of the brain that also only occurred when the men were judging the attractive female faces. And what we think is that this reflects the more evolutionary-based functional appraisal of the opposite sex. When the man sees an attractive female face, the reduction in the fusiform gyrus could reflect that the normal face perception system is turned down and that the frontal lobes are activated, reflecting that the functional appraisal of that individual is taking over. So it seems that the brain realizes that what it's seeing is actually an attractive member of the opposite sex, and therefore decides that this isn't a normal situation, needs to buck up and take note, as this could be a potential mate for them. We're now in the process of extending this study, as we need to establish whether this same system is activated in straight women when they're appraising attractive men. Furthermore, we want to see if there's a different pattern of activation associated with the appraisal of attractive women by women. And if this is the case, if there is a difference here, it would reflect that finding of our first study that pointed to only women being able to perceive aesthetical beauty. Now, if we can differentiate the patterns of activity associated between functional and aesthetic appraisal, then the natural next step is to then look at the brain activation associated when gay and lesbian people are judging attractiveness. If there's no evolutionary undercurrent to the homosexual attraction towards the same sex, we then should see activation that's only associated with the aesthetic appraisal. And theoretically, this should match the activation that we see when women are judging the attractiveness of other women. And also additionally, I'd also like to use faces which are actually known to show the phi proportions. As this phi ratio describes all aspects of the world which are aesthetically appealing, maybe the brain has a specific system that is activated to these features. So that's one side of my work where I'm looking at facial beauty. I'm now going to talk to you about the appraisal of beautiful bodies And the main reason that I'm interested in this is because of the existence of eating disorders. In our society, food isn't something anymore that just keeps us alive. We're obsessed with it. Chefs are celebrities, cookbooks make it into the best-selling list, and we even have television channels which are devoted to cooking. But at the same time, more and more people are becoming overweight, and the desire to lose weight is now a million-pound business. Given this odd relationship that we have with food, it's not surprising then that eating is subject to a psychopathological disorder. Now, an eating disorder is any persistent disturbance of eating behaviour or behaviours intending to control weight, which significantly impairs both the physical and the mental health of the individual. It's thought that between 0.5 and 3% of the population are diagnosed with an eating disorder, although many people do display eating and weight control behaviours that lie just below that clinical level. Now, historically, eating disorders are seen to be a female problem, with 90 to 95% of diagnoses being given to women. However, as with many mental health issues, this gender imbalance could simply reflect the fact that men are less likely to come forward for help when they're suffering from a psychological problem. The higher rates of eating disorders do tend to be associated with participation in certain activities and professions where lean bodies are considered to be advantageous. And in these cases, we don't see this gender imbalance as many men as women suffer. So, for example, if we looked at fashion models or long-distance running, we see an equal distribution of eating disorders amongst men and women. One aspect of eating disorders, though, that is consistent is the age of onset. In the majority of cases, a diagnosis will be made during adolescence or early adulthood. Now, there are two main types of eating disorders, anorexia nervosa and bulimia nervosa. But today I'm only going to talk to you about anorexia because it is strongly linked to an abnormal perception of body shape and attractiveness. The term anorexia is a literal translation of the Greek phrase meaning a nervous loss of appetite. But this does then lead to a misconception. The majority of people who are diagnosed with anorexia don't actually lose their interest in food. Often they're obsessed with food and will cook large gourmet meals for the family. It's their own personal relationship with food that is the cause of the problem. What we do see in an individual diagnosed with anorexia is that they rarely weigh more than the minimum body weight for their age and height. And on average, patients are between 25 and 30% below this minimum at the time that they're referred for clinical help. Now, often, anorexia is preceded by a successful healthy weight loss, and the individual is incredibly proud about the amount of weight that they've lost and the amount of control that they have over their calorific intake. Now, this obsession develops into an intense fear of obesity, and so the relentless pursuit of thinness begins. There are two subtypes of anorexia, and they are reflecting the different types of behaviours that are shown. So in restricting type, the individual's calorific intake is severely restricted using a mixture of diet and exercise, while in binge eating purging type, the individual relies on purging to control their food intake. Therefore, after every meal, they'll ensure that the food immediately leaves their body, either through self-induced vomiting or the use of laxatives. Now, accompanying this obsession with thinness is a marked disturbance in their perception of their own body image. Regardless of the reality of the situation, somebody experiencing anorexia will still see somebody who needs to lose weight, and they will perceive themselves to be flabby and have excess fat on their bodies. Now, one reason why eating disorders stand out from other psychopathologies is the impact that happens to the individual's body as well as their mental health. Alongside the maladaptive thinking that underlies these disorders, there's a number of different physical problems as the body tries to cope with starvation and with purging. And in the long term, the consequences of these problems can be fatal. More than with other eating disorders, anorexia can lead to long-term neurochemical imbalances, and it is associated strongly with the experience of depression. The delicate balance of electrolytes within the body becomes disturbed as a result of the starvation and purging that the individual performs. Now, these are the chemicals, potassium, magnesium, and sodium, that are present in our body in order to maintain healthy cell functioning and in order for the neurons to communicate within our brain. The individual's vascular system will be placed under extreme pressure, and they're likely to experience both heart and blood problems. In fact, heart failure is the most common cause of death in severe cases of anorexia. Now, unsurprisingly, the individual is likely to be very weak, but they'll also have swollen joints and will be at more risk of suffering from osteoporosis. It's likely that their kidneys will start to malfunction, and in severe cases, this can lead to kidney failure. And one of the biggest impacts on the female body is that their periods will stop completely. Furthermore, if the individual continues to show anorexic behaviours when they're pregnant, there are serious consequences for the unborn child. Finally, there's a very distinct look to somebody who's suffering from anorexia. The hair on their head will become very thin and brittle, and there'll be a downy hair that grows all over their cheeks and their limbs, and this is called lanugo. They'll bruise more easily, and their skin can take on a yellowish hue. Now, it's obvious that these very physical signs of anorexia do not help with the high degree of body dissatisfaction or body dysmorphia that somebody who is suffering from anorexia naturally experiences. Now, body dysmorphia often precedes the diagnosis of anorexia and is a key feature of the experience of anorexia itself. The symptoms of dysmorphia are subsumed within the symptomology of eating disorders. The individual abnormally associates their body to their sense of identity. So it's very common for people to think that if they become thinner, that will directly lead to them being a better person. They'll also be focused on the fact that their body doesn't reach their beauty ideal. Now, there are two problems here. First is that the body ideal that's presented in the media is usually unobtainable by the majority of people. And secondly, that people suffering from anorexia misperceive their own body shape, so they're not even making a true comparison within the first place. Now, in the period of time before the diagnosis of anorexia, this harsh criticism of their own body leads the individual to experience continual negative thoughts about their body shape, and so this unhealthy pattern of behaviour begins. Now, it's quite difficult to scientifically investigate how people actually experience these feelings of body dissatisfaction, as they're such a personal psychological experience. But Martin Tovey, a psychologist at Newcastle University who I've recently started collaborating with, has overcome this problem by designing a piece of interactive software that uses biometric data from real body shapes. By using this program, the individual is allowed to alter the body parts using the sliders on the right to create in a naturalistic way their ideal and then their actual body shape. The individual's actual body mass index can then be recorded and then compared to the BMI that's calculated from the ideal and actual body shapes that they show in the software. This process allowed Martin to compare anorexic, bulimic and control groups' perceptions of their own and their ideal body shapes. and the results were really interesting. When the participants produced images that represented their own shapes, all three groups overestimated their body size in comparison to their actual body mass index. However, none of these estimations were significant. It was just a general trend that was within the data. When the group's ideal body shape was considered, though, it was a different matter. Both the control and the bulimic group produced an ideal body shape that had an average BMI of 20. So that you can have a comparison, Kate Moss has a BMI of 20. So this represents a body shape which sits at the lowest end of the healthy BMI range. So even people who aren't diagnosed with an eating disorder within that control group still have an ideal which is unhealthy. The anorexic group, however, chose a body shape that has an equivalent BMI of 15. Now this lies on the border between the BMIs that represent emaciated and underweight individuals. So we can see that there's an extreme misconception of what constitutes a healthy, attractive body. So as a result, Martin, myself, and my boss at Aston, Ian Holliday, have just begun a series of studies to try and establish whether this maladaptive body perception is purely a psychological problem or if it reflects abnormal brain activation. So the first stage of this series of experiments is to try and quantify the brain processes that are associated with rating body attractiveness in a healthy population. To do this, we ask people to rate how attractive they think different bodies are, and these are the pictures that we used. The bodies fall into two categories: those which have previously consistently been rated as attractive, and those that were previously consistently rated as unattractive. Now, the reason why the photos here have a grid over them is so that we can produce a control image for the neuroimaging experiment. The jigsaw image that you can see underneath contains all the same visual information as the images that we're interested in, but obviously you can't tell that they're a body, so that we're activating all those same visual systems, but we can then hopefully focus in on the activations that are associated with the appraisal of the body shape. Now, the first interesting finding was that we found activation in what's thought to be the extrastriate body area. Now, in the same way that the brain has an area that's specialized for the perception of faces, people are beginning to think that there's also an area specialized for body perception. Now, previous studies that have shown this have used line drawings in order to test the experimental hypothesis. And these line drawings are a little bit odd, and you can never be sure that it reflects the perception of actual bodies. So it was really nice to see that we had this same area of activation found. Secondly, we found an area in the frontal lobes that was only activated when the participants, who were both men and women, were looking at the bodies that they rated as being attractive. So maybe here we found an area that's involved in the appraisal of attraction. And so again, we're opening up another box of questions, and it gives us a route to follow our research with. So what we want to do now is replicate these findings in another healthy population to confirm that this appraisal area exists. And then to have a little bit more control over the experiment, we've decided to use some of these biometrically designed body shapes so that we have more control over how different the body shapes are, so we can see the influence of BMI on how attractive people see the bodies to be. If we then confirm our initial results, there are two things we then want to do. The first is a theoretical question, as we want to compare this potential area for body appraisal with the frontal activations that we saw in the facial attractiveness study. Are the faces and bodies judged differently, or are they controlled by the same process? And is body attractiveness underpinned by the same evolutionary factors, or is there an aesthetic appraisal as well? The second is a clinical application of our findings. I want to perform the same judgment experiment, but with people who have been diagnosed with anorexia. And hopefully this will then allow us to establish whether the same pattern of activity is associated with their appraisal of body attractiveness, and therefore allow us to have some form of information of this debilitating symptom of the disorder.
You know your work on anorexia, are you thinking of sort of extending it to possibly perceiving like how, you know how we all like different things in people? Would you ever like extend it to sort of how we might sort of perceive different characteristics?
Yeah, well, one of the things that I'm quite interested in doing is not just have people perceiving whether they think a certain body shape is attractive, but actually comparing it with their own body shape. Because this is all about a misperception of how they compare to reality and to other people. If we can have a look to see if there's a problem with their appraisal of others in comparison to themselves.
Yeah, like you know how sort of some people might go, well, I'm quite sort of, you know, big, I like big men or something. Do you think it can be quite sort of extended to that?
Yeah, that would be an ideal way of looking at it, to see more if there is types, because all these evolutionary theories are very interesting, but they don't account for the fact that people like all sorts of people, and these beautiful people, as beautiful as they are, aren't that common. And the majority of people like an ordinary person who to them is the most gorgeous person in the world. So it'd be really interesting to focus in on what makes somebody attractive to that individual.
Hello, it was really interesting talk. I just wanted to ask you how you might be able to distinguish between a functional choice of who's attractive and sort of the other. So whether it's to do with reproductive fitness or whether you just find them genuinely attractive.
We're hoping that I think one of the main ways we'll be able to do that is by focusing on the difference between what people who are homosexual find attractive and what straight people find attractive, because immediately you are taking out that evolutionary association. There may be some rudimentary influence on them because we're not aware that we're looking at evolutionary characteristics when as a straight person you're appraising somebody, but it just may be it's more heightened within homosexual individuals that theirs is a true aesthetic appreciation. And what we're going to be looking for is more higher order cognitive processes. So therefore focusing on the amygdala, which is a part of the brain that's involved in the experience of emotion, which wouldn't be associated with the evolutionary factors, and also more frontal lobe activation, which is associated with a social reward and looking at the longer term consequences of the attraction.
How about bisexual people?
Again, that would be really interesting because then it gives you that midway point.
Yeah, exactly.
Because, I mean, I personally believe that sexuality itself anyway is on a continuum. If you're able to use people who fall along that continuum, it would be interesting to see whether the brain activation equally is modulated by where they fall. And that would be a really nice way of looking at that.
Have you done any work on the effects of alcohol and how attractive you find people? Because I think it's well known that that tends to change during the course of an evening.
The beer gobble
I've heard.
effect.
Someone's called it that once. I wouldn't know.
I'm not making any comment of who I saw you at down the pub last Saturday night at all. Yeah, that would be a really nice thing to look at.
I'll do it for you if you want.
Okay, sorry. We'll go down the pub now, pop in to use the scanner, show you the pictures, do the ratings.
Sorted.
If I could get ethical approval, I would love to do a piece of...
Would you have trouble getting ethical approval
We
of that thing?
might do. To actually give somebody alcohol, then get them into the scanner.
I could just happen to turn up drunk.
That may be the way. Just sort of like...
As I do on a daily basis here.
Are you sure they're walking straight? No, it's fine, he's just got a bit of a limp. We could work around it some way.
But it's
Seriously, it would be really interesting to see, get people to rate faces when they're sober, rate them when they're attractive, and is that going to be more of a pure aesthetic look? Is it just like, oh, you're beautiful, you are?
I love you.
Exactly. So yeah, that would be a really nice thing to do.
I wonder whether you have any way of taking into account the difference between the sort of inbuilt evolutionary response to attractiveness as opposed to a sort of media conditioned response. In other words, we're told by exposure that these people are attractive, and therefore that programs us to make that judgment. And whether that would be different across different cultures.
Yeah, if I'd have been doing this work back in 1992, I would have been able to do just that. There was a study produced by Becker looking at a Fijian population that had, up until the mid-80s, not had any Western influence on them. They had no television, no impact of the Western media had been on them. Their incidence of eating disorders was 1 in about 50 years. So this was a very pure population. And they looked at eating behaviours in a group of teenage girls just as the television was introduced, and then again 3 years later. And the differences were immense. They were showing self-induced vomiting in order to control their body image. They were showing symptoms of body dysmorphia. They were explaining how the Fijian ideal of being large, which was attributed to very positive characteristics, as opposed to the negative connotations that you tend to have in Western societies, they were beginning to show these. So there was huge friction between generations because the girls were saying, I want to look like those Western girls. Look at, they're so pretty, they have all these friends, I want to be like that, I don't want to be fat like you are, Mum. So it really affected them. And if you'd have had that population, it would have been absolutely ideal, because that is the problem. It's so insidious within our population, within our environment. It would be really difficult to control for that kind of influence. So it's just a shame that we weren't there.
To what extent do you think these kinds of things are responsible for anorexia? Because anorexics that I've met certainly don't feel that it's to do with the kind of things that you talked about. For example, trying to strive towards this bodily ideal. It's to do with more general problems with self-esteem. I think it might be quite interesting to look at women across that spectrum, from people who are happy with their body weight to people who diet sensibly to people who diet unhealthily to anorexia, and see how much that bodily ideal changes.
Yeah, absolutely. As with any symptom of any psychopathology, people show it in a graded way. And there will be some that the body dysmorphia is very acute and very focused on a media ideal. And then there'll be those that it's just based on their own ideal. And you're very right, it's all linked into their own self-image. So it will be very different. So that would be a really nice way to look at that in the continuum that you've just described.
Do you ever integrate what you know with things like, peripheral molecules? Like you've got leptin and ghrelin and stuff like that. Do you ever sort of look at areas where they're activated, like the hypothalamus, and just sort of see how it's all linked together, sort of, because we've obviously got this sort of big drive from our body to eat and stay alive. Do you?
Well, the only problem you have there is actually monitoring those kind of chemicals and hormones. There are some brain imaging methods based around MRI where you can try to focus in on some chemicals, but there's a few chemicals that you can do it successfully with because they're not imaged in the same way that the hydrogen atoms are, so we can't look at them. And if you look at the metabolic end products of these chemicals, it's difficult to say, well, was there a lot to begin with? So it would be nice if we had a way of actually measuring these chemicals within the brain and see their influence. And and directly see that influence.
Yeah. Do you have any good animal models of like eating disorders like anorexia and stuff yet?
Yeah, there are quite a few that look at the effect of starvation on eating patterns, and how they reinforce the non-eating. It's been done a lot in rats, and it's found that once they enter starvation for a distinct length of time, that they then almost find it hard to begin eating again anyway, because there is a form of enjoyment, if that's the right word to attribute to an animal, that the starvation phase is easier to live within. And even if food is offered to them, they won't eat it. So those are the kind of animal models that are used. But there tends to be a growing move to getting away from animal models of human behaviour. There is very much a time and place, I feel, for animal experimentation. But when you're trying to attribute it to a very psychological process that's behind eating disorders, it's difficult to know how useful they really are.
If you think that media images and culture have a strong influence on people's perception of body ideals, do you think there is a case to be made for censorship or regulation of the media and the fashion industry?
No. As nice as it would be to do that and imagine that we'd produce an ideal world, I don't think it would make any difference. The problem is the images that we see. If you go to a fashion show, clothes look beautiful on the types of bodies that models have. What you want to have is the realism displayed to people about those body shapes, that it is a very rare body shape and that it's achieved because of these reasons, and encourage people to realise that it's far more healthy to think about body image in relation to their own health, their own perception, rather than saying, let's pretend that there are no tall, thin, beautiful models, because they're as much a part of life as every other body shape.